Hello guys, and welcome to this new episode of the Unexplainable podcast. What I'm telling you today is not a simple ghost story. It's a real case that became very famous in the 70s and still raises many questions today. It is said to be one of the most famous paranormal cases in the world. The fact that it originated from one of the most known and terrible aviation tragedies in the past makes it even more distressing. Are you ready to feel a shiver down your spine? Here are the ghosts of Flight 401. Ghosts. It's a real case that became very famous in the 70s and still raises many questions today. It is said to be one of the most famous paranormal cases in the world. The fact that it originated from one of the disaster. It was a cold night on December 29, 1972, when Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was preparing to land in Miami, Florida. Departing from New York, the flight was carrying 163 passengers and 13 crew members. For many, it was a completely normal evening. There were families returning home after the Christmas holidays, businessmen ready to get back to work, and couples looking for a break in the warm Florida weather. On board, the crew was made up of experienced professionals. Captain Robert Loft, with over 30 years of service, sat at the controls, along with First Officer Albert Stocksel and Flight Engineer Donald Rippo. All were considered competent and reliable pilots with great experience and accustomed to handling large commercial flights. Nothing foreshadowed the impending tragedy. But within a matter of minutes, the relaxed atmosphere on the plane changed dramatically. As the plane approached Miami, an apparently minor problem caught the crew's attention. The landing gear didn't seem to have descended correctly, or at least that's what a light on the control panel indicated. Loft decided to perform a holding pattern to check the situation. Landing in that condition was extremely dangerous. The plane was then set to autopilot and began to fly in circles over the Everglades, a vast swampy area of Florida. At that point, the crew focused entirely on resolving the landing gear issue, but during the operations, something went terribly wrong. The autopilot was accidentally deactivated and the plane began to lose altitude. Slowly. The crew was busy trying to fix the malfunction and figure out if the landing gear was actually stuck. And that distraction was fatal. By the time the pilot realized the dangerous descent, it was already too late. At 23:42, Flight 401 crashed into the Everglades swamps at a speed of over 300 km per hour. The impact was devastating. The plane broke into several sections and debris scattered for hundreds of meters. The silence of the night was shattered by a deafening roar, followed by the agonizing screams of the survivors. Despite the severity of the accident, 75 people managed to survive, many thanks to the fact that the marshes cushioned the impact. However, 101 people lost their lives, including Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill. Donna Rippo, the flight engineer, initially survived but died a few days later in the hospital due to her injuries. Investigations began, the result of which revealed a disturbing fact. The tragedy was caused by a combination of human error and technical problems. The landing gear indicator was indeed faulty. The landing gear had actually descended correctly, but the crew was unable to verify it with certainty. This lack, coupled with the panic generated by the situation, led one of the pilots to mistakenly turn off the autopilot, and the consequences were inevitable. The emotional impact of the disaster was enormous. The public wondered how an accident of such magnitude could have been caused by such a trivial mistake. The airline suffered a devastating blow to its reputation, but it also serves as a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry. In the wake of the incident, new procedures were introduced for emergency management and reducing distractions in the cockpit. But the consequences in the years following would also be of a different kind, of an unexplainable nature between legend and reality. There's no doubt that the incident of Flight 401 left an indelible mark not only in the history of aviation, but also in the collective imagination. The tragedy was already horrifying in itself, but it was in the weeks following the incident that the situation became even darker. Some employees of Eastern Airlines began to report a series of chilling phenomena, of which they had been protagonists during their service on board various company planes. One of the most notable sightings involves an Eastern Airlines pilot who was in the cockpit on one of the airliners. During preparations for takeoff, the man noticed a figure sitting in one of the seats reserved for the additional crew. At first, he ignored it, assuming it was a coworker, but when he checked the crew list to find out the name and greet him, he realized that he was not included in it. Disturbed, the man approached him to ask for explanations, and the figure, with a gaze lost in the void, claimed to be called Bob Loft. It only took a few moments before the pilot made the connection. Bob Loft, that was the name of the captain who died in the tragic accident of Flight 401. He immediately thought it was a tasteless joke, but when he realized that the character was not smiling and maintained his impassive expression, he began to feel a deep unease. It was only a few moments when the pilot, petrified, found himself unable to react, and before he could gather the strength to do so, the figure vanished into thin air. The event was so impressive that the entire crew requested an inspection of the aircraft to check if there was an intruder on board. But the description that was given of the figure left no room for doubt. It matched perfectly those photographs of the deceased commander. Another one of the most famous stories features a flight attendant busy in the rear kitchen of the plane arranging drinks and meals. While she was busy with her tasks, almost driven by an unknown force, she turned around and saw a man in a pilot's uniform leaning on the counter. She too immediately thought of a colleague and approached him to ask if he needed anything. The mysterious character did not react in any way to her questions. He remained there, silent, as if he was deeply absorbed in his thoughts. Then, in the same way he had appeared, he disappeared under the woman's incredulous eyes. Confused and scared, the flight attendant rushed to tell the rest of the crew what had happened, who initially thought she was joking, or in the worst case, that she had a hallucination due to fatigue. Then one of the colleagues who had heard about the strange phenomenon that one of the pilots had witnessed in the past suggested a chilling theory. What if that figure had been one of the spirit's victims of the famous accident that happened some time ago? Immediately after, the stewardess was shown a photograph of the personnel who died on Flight 401, and among the people who appeared in the image, she immediately identified Don Repo, the engineer in charge of the flight that night. The phenomenon that involves another stewardess from one of the Eastern Airlines flights is in a certain sense even more disturbing. During an in-flight service, she opened the cart to prepare the orders. While arranging some bottles, she noticed a reflection in the shiny metal of the cart. At first, she didn't pay much attention to it, but upon closer inspection, she realized it wasn't her own reflection, but the face of a middle-aged man. Thinking that someone was behind her, she quickly turned around. But there was nothing. She was completely alone at that point in the plane. She looked again in the direction of the mysterious reflection, and the man was still there, with two piercing eyes staring at her. She screamed in terror and rushed to tell the other crew members what had happened. When they showed her a photo of Don Repo, she immediately recognized the face she had just seen reflected in the cart. And the victims of these strange phenomena were not just the onboard staff members. For instance, one day an Eastern Airlines technician who was performing a routine check on a fleet aircraft noticed a figure next to him silently watching him. He immediately thought it was one of the on-duty pilots. He asked him what his name was and what he could do for him. And the mysterious individual immediately identified himself as Don Ripple. The technician couldn't recall the pilots' names who were victims of the accident months prior, so he calmly stayed to listen to the apparition. He spoke to it calmly, pointing out an electrical system component that needed immediate checking. The technician followed the advice and discovered a serious defect that, if not repaired, could have caused serious problems during the flight. After turning around again to thank the pilot, the latter had faded into nothingness. In a matter of seconds, he had completely disappeared from the aircraft, leaving the technician speechless. It was only when he told a colleague about what happened that he was able to make sense of it all. It seems that the spirit of Don Repo wanted to somehow protect the passengers that day and prevent a disaster similar to the one in which he lost his life. And to conclude, one of the strangest warnings is the one that involved a group of passengers, at least a dozen, as the story goes. A few minutes after takeoff, they noticed a man in a pilot's uniform sitting calmly next to them. The situation was already strange in itself. Why would a pilot be sitting in the rows reserved for passengers? The man was friendly but spoke little and answered the questions that were asked of him with only very short sentences, almost monosyllabic. Some of the witnesses described him as reassuring. His mere presence was capable of instilling an almost unnatural calm. Each of the attendees assured that he was there right after takeoff. But when one of the flight attendants approached the seat where he was sitting to offer him a service, he had disappeared. Those who had seen him until a few seconds before the arrival of the attendant were shocked. Where had he gone? Why had no one seen him get up and leave his seat? Later, when some photographs of the Flight 401 crew were shown to the passengers, each of them identified without hesitation that it was Bob Loft. This incident became one of the most famous among those reported, first of all because it involved numerous witnesses, and secondly because it suggested that the apparitions were not limited to the crew but could also be perceived by the passengers. The reactions of those who have encountered the spirits of Loft and Repo vary. Some describe an initial sense of fear or disbelief, but many testify to a feeling of calm or comfort once the identity of the apparitions is realized. A flight attendant, after seeing Repo, stated, "It didn't scare me. It seemed like he wanted to protect us." Not everyone, however, has taken these stories seriously. Eastern Airlines tried to downplay the reported stories, worried that they could damage its reputation. However, the persistence and consistency of the testimonies have made these sightings an indelible chapter in history. Aviation. At this point, though, one had to ask a question. What was the reason behind the phenomenon? Why did it keep happening? Mystery lovers and unexplainable phenomena enthusiasts all agree on one point, that behind every paranormal phenomenon, there is almost always a fundamental reason. Violent deaths, the desire for revenge from victims of an injustice, or whatever else can lead spirits tied to a place to manifest themselves. But in this case, how do you explain the fact the ghosts of the accident victims appeared on other planes of the company? For what reason? The answer is as simple as it is disturbing. The first to investigate the phenomena quickly brought to light a surprising detail. Many of the planes involved in these sightings had been repaired using recycled parts from Flight 401. You understood perfectly. Eastern Airlines, in an attempt to save on costs, had indeed recovered some undamaged components from the wreckage and installed them on other aircraft in its fleet. If it's true that ghosts are tied to the traumatic events they experienced at the moment of transition between the world of the living and the dead, how can one not think that every part of the aircraft where they lost their lives became imbued with their energy? This theory is one of the most recognized in the world of the supernatural. According to it, the emotional and physical energy released in an extreme moment of stress or fear could imprint on the surrounding environment, giving rise to spectral manifestations. This is what is called the concept of energy residue. Recycled objects can therefore serve as spiritual conductors, carrying the residual energy of the deceased and facilitating their appearances. But is everything that has been told about the ghosts of Flight 401 real, or the product of a fervent imagination? It's time to give the floor to the skeptics. Obviously, skeptics have always considered the stories of paranormal phenomena related to the crash of Flight 401 as mere folk legends. It's hard to believe all these unexplainable sightings of the spirits of the victims on other planes of the company. The question, however, arises spontaneously. Why were there so many testimonies of this kind? The explanations could be various. One of the most credited is the one that attributes such sightings to a phenomenon of collective suggestion. In a context like aviation, where work pressure is high and stories circulate quickly, it is possible that the crew was overly influenced by the stories of their colleagues. The human mind, especially in situations of anxiety or stress, can easily create visual and auditory illusions. Another rational hypothesis has to do with a pathology that often occurs in certain contexts and situations, but that most of us ignore: post-traumatic stress disorder. The crews of the planes on which parts of Flight 401's plane were installed were aware of where those components came from, and this awareness could have triggered unconscious emotional reactions. In some cases, this disorder can manifest with symptoms that include hallucinations and obsessive thoughts. From there, the ghost sightings. Among other things, psychologists emphasize how humans have an innate tendency to seek explanations for what they do not understand, often resorting to the supernatural. According to some experts, ghost stories can serve as a mechanism to process grief and deal with tragic events. If we add to this the possibility that the story may have been amplified by modern folklore, the game is done. Ghost stories often follow narrative patterns that strengthen over time, transforming an isolated anecdote into a collective myth. To put it simply, we should not be surprised to discover that the legend of Flight 401 has been enriched and distorted by those who told it. Regardless, this story has had a significant impact on popular culture, inspiring books, movies, and television shows. The book The Ghost of Flight 401 by John Fowler, published in 1976, helped spread the story globally, presenting it as a documented case of paranormal activity. Subsequently, the book was adapted into a television movie, further increasing public interest. Television programs like Unsolved Mysteries and Ghost Hunters often referred to Flight 401, ranking it among the most famous cases of spectral sightings. The story has also influenced film narrative, inspiring works that combine the theme of the paranormal with that of aviation. So it was inevitable that it would come to us as a credible story endorsed by many people. But what do you think of the ghosts of Flight 401? Just legends, or could what is told have a grain of truth? Let me know in a comment. Unexplainable Podcast is a series conceived, written, and hosted by Luca Perella, sound designed by Matteo D. Alessandro. Listen to it on YouTube or on all music and podcast platforms. Thanks to everyone